Today's activity is going to look at the air war over Germany. Part of Germany's strategy in the early years of the war was bombing Allied cities, causing terror and destruction. The Luftwaffe had bombed Warsaw, Rotterdam, Belgrade, and then, during the Blitz, London and other British cities. But by 1942, the US and Britain built up large forces of bombers. The Allied bombers were much better and with longer ranges than the Germans ever built. And with American factories out of reach of the Luftwaffe, they kept increasing their force. So now it was time for the Allies to bomb and destroy German cities. During the London Blitz, the British started to bomb German cities. Now, during the war, the Allies' goal was to, 1, destroy Germany's industrial ability to produce military weapons, and 2, to destroy the morale of the German civilians, make them not want to fight back. Now, on December 16, 1940, British bombers hit Mannheim, Germany. This was the first terror raid, the idea to destroy buildings and kill people to scare them and want them not to fight anymore. This is the start of the British moving away from precision attacks on military targets and towards area bombing attacks on whole cities. This was called carpet bombings. The British strategy is factories can be rebuilt, so instead, kill the factory workers and destroy their homes. This was mainly caused by the British inability to hit precision targets. In mid-1942, the U.S. 8th Air Force arrived in Britain. Unlike the British, the Americans would carry out high-altitude precision attacks on military targets. Americans had better technology. This includes the Norton bomb sight that would allow the Americans to hit factories, naval bases, shipyards, railroads, power plants, steel mills, airfields, and so on. In 1942, the US and Britain start bombing military and civilian targets in occupied Europe, mostly Germany. The British would bomb at night and the Americans during the day. Now, the British RAF Bomber Command was led by Sir Arthur Harris, also known as Bomber Harris. He was a very controversial figure in the war, especially toward the end when he continued to bomb German cities when it was obvious Germany was about to lose the war. His famous quote, "The Nazis entered the war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everyone else and no one was going to bomb them." At Rotterdam, London, Warsaw, and half 100 other places, they put their rather naive theory into operation. They sowed the wind, and now they're going to reap the whirlwind. Now, American Bomber Command, the United States Army Air Force, now this is before the Air Force will become a separate branch of the military. During World War II, the Air Force was actually part of the United States Army. Thus, it was called the United States Army Air Force. After the war, they will split off and become the U.S. Air Force. But at the time, the Bomber Command was the 8th Air Force and was led by a General Henry Hap Arnold. Now let's look at the planes that the Allies and the Germans use in the air war. The British bombers were the Halifax, had a range of 1,860 miles and carried 13,000 pounds of bombs. And their best plane, the Lancaster, had a range of 2,530 miles and carried 14,000 pounds of bombs. Both carried a 7-man crew and had a top speed of 282 miles per hour. Now we'll look at the American bombers. The primary heavy bomber of the U.S. Air Force was the B-17 Flying Fortress. It was the top bomber in the war. It had a range of 2,000 miles and carried 12,800 pounds of bombs. It was also defended by 13 50-inch caliber machine guns that covered all the areas around it. I had a chance to fly in one of these planes last Labor Day, and it was really an exciting experience. The other primary And also, they could take a lot of punishment. They actually could fly with 3 of the 4 engines out of commission. Wouldn't do very well, but they could make it back. The other bomber was the B-24 Liberator. This had a range of 2,100 miles and carried 12,800 pounds of bombs. The bad side was they every now and then they tended to blow up in air. Both carried a 10-man crew as opposed to 7 by the British, and had a top speed of 287 to 290 miles per hour. Now we're going to look at the American planes, primarily the fighter planes that would escort the bombers over Germany. Their mission was to keep the German fighter planes from shooting down the American and British bombers. Now, the Americans had 2 primary fighter planes. The P-47, called the Thunderbolt, was among the best fighters produced in the war. Had a speed of 433 miles per hour and a range of 800. But by far the best was the P-51 Mustang. It had a speed of 437 miles per hour, and with these detachable gas tanks, you can see one in the picture here, they could actually fly 1,650 miles. They could reach Berlin and back better than any other plane in the war. Basically, they would have these gasoline tanks you can see here attached to the bottom. The plane would keep pulling in gasoline from those tanks, but when they're about to go into combat, they would jettison the tanks. You certainly don't want to have a gasoline tank slung to the bottom of your plane while the enemy is shooting bullets at you. And then they would go into combat. Now we're going to look at the German fighters. The primary German fighters were the Messerschmitt 109. This was one of Germany's best fighter planes, speed of 398 miles per hour, and the Germans made 34,000 of them. The Germans also had the Focke-Wulf 190. This was very popular among the German pilots at a speed of 426 miles per hour and could take a lot of punishment before being shot down. Now, in May of 1942, 1,000 British bombers hit the German city of Cologne. This was the first of what they would call the 1,000 bomber raid. Now, Cologne is an industrial city in northwest Germany of about 770,000 people. Germany's 4th largest city. During the war, Cologne would be bombed a total of 262 times. By 1945, 90% of the city was destroyed. Only 476 civilians were killed, but 45,000 were made homeless, and 250 factories were destroyed. Here we see the flames and smoke coming up from the city after the bombing attack. And by the end of the war, you can see all the bridges had been destroyed and most of the downtown area had been reduced to rubble. The famous Cologne Cathedral, which was heavily damaged, was repaired after the war. Here we see a picture of a German woman walking down the street, and you can just see the piles of the bodies that were killed in the bombing raid. Now, the British thought 1,000 bomber raids would, 1, cause enough devastation to knock Germany out of the war, and 2, severely hurt the morale of the German people, who may force the German government to ask for peace. In July of 1943, the British bombed Hamburg in 2 large night raids. Hamburg is Germany's largest port city of 1.7 million people, Germany's 2nd largest city. This is a picture of Hamburg before the war. 787 British Halifax and Lancaster bombers target civilian areas of Hamburg. Here's a picture taken from one of the British bombers showing all the fires down below, and it's silhouetting another British bomber below it. 550 to 600 bomb loads fell into an area measuring only 2 miles by 1 mile. The bombing caused a firestorm, killing 42,600 civilians in those 2 nights. So many firebombs were dropped, a vortex and whirling updraft of superheated air created a 1,500-foot tornado of fire. Many died by carbon monoxide poisoning when all the air was drawn out of their basement shelters. Here we see a photograph of German citizens who had been killed by the bombings and their bodies charred. It damaged 80% of the city. Nazi leadership was shocked. The atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki did not do as much fire damage as the extended airstrikes on Hamburg. This is today one of the churches in Hamburg that was destroyed, but the tower is still standing, so it's now a peace memorial. This is a memorial that was built after the war and still is there today for those who died in a shelter that was under a department store when the firestorm sucked all the air out of the shelter, killing everyone who was inside. Now in August and again in October of 1943, the United States is going to attempt its first major bombing attacks over Germany. They're going to attempt 2 daylight raids on the German city of Schweinfurt a month apart. They had no fighter escorts since the P-51 wasn't there yet, and none of the American fighter planes could follow all the way to Germany and back. You see a picture of the B-17s flying towards Schweinfurt. The Americans suffer heavy losses. 137 B-17s were shot down, with another 77 returning damaged. Unescorted bombers were no match for German fighters, so the Americans decided to halt bombing raids until a long-range fighter could go with them. Now in late 1943, the British bombers will start a 3.5-month period of bombing raids on Berlin, called the Air Battle of Berlin. Now since the British bombed at night, there wasn't as much of concern since the German planes couldn't fly at nighttime, so they were able to go without fighter escorts. Now since Berlin is the capital of Germany, and it's where Hitler lives, Berlin is heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns all around the city. The Germans built these, what they called flak towers. You can see one on the right of the photograph there. These are like 8-story buildings of almost solid concrete. And they put anti-aircraft guns, known as flak guns, on top of these structures in an attempt to shoot down Allied planes. They were so heavily made of concrete and steel that after the war, some of them weren't even able to be torn down because they were that strong, and they're still in Berlin today. Here we see one of the downtown streets of Berlin, one of the Berlin train stations. Here's the Hertie department store in Berlin, or what's left of it. This here was the Catholic Cathedral of Berlin. It had a large dome. It had been built back in the 1800s. This is what it looks like today. When I went to visit it back 10 years ago, we went to Palm Sunday Mass here. They've obviously repaired it and have done a lot of repairing after the war, but it took 30, 40, 50 years to do this. The problem with bombing Berlin was it was too far away, the city is too big, and it was too well defended. Another strange thing was Berlin always seemed to be cloudy, which made it very difficult for the Allied bombers to see the targets. Now, in this air battle of Berlin, the British will lose 1,000 bombers, including 7,000 airmen. It is considered a failure because of the high losses in planes and airmen, and it didn't end the war like Harris predicted. Now, in the winter of 1943, the Americans introduced the P-51 Mustang. This was a long-range fighter escort. In early 1944, P-51s were taken off bomber escort and sent in to destroy Luftwaffe planes. In the first week alone, the Germans lost 17% of their fighter force. This switch from defense to offense crippled the Luftwaffe, and it greatly reduced the threat to the bombers. During World War II, Mustang pilots claimed 4,950 enemy aircraft shot down. Goering was quoted as saying, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was over." The Big Week, February 1944. Bombing missions against airplane factories intended to lure the Luftwaffe into air battles with American fighters. This was very similar to the German strategy in the Battle of Britain. The goal was to defeat the Luftwaffe and achieve air superiority over Europe. In 6 days, the U.S. flew more than 3,500 flights and dropped 10,000 tons of bombs. The Luftwaffe suffered heavy losses of planes and pilots, and the Allies were on their way to gaining air superiority over Europe. The Allies' destruction of bridges, dams, and factories started to really hurt Germany's ability to produce weapons. Here we see bridges in Germany, railroad bridges they needed to move materials around, destroyed. Dams that they used for hydroelectric power were destroyed. Factories, you can see the roof gone. In March 4th, the U.S. launches its first bombing raids against Berlin. 800 B-17 bombers bombed Berlin 4 times in 2 weeks. 69 B-17s were lost, but the Luftwaffe lost 160 aircraft. The Allies were easily replacing their losses with new planes coming from America, but the Luftwaffe could not. The Luftwaffe was running out of planes and pilots. Now, Germany will produce the first jet fighter plane ever used in a war, the Messerschmitt 262, at a top speed of 540 miles per hour. It could have been devastating to the Allies, but they were developed late in the war. Only 1,430 were built. Hitler actually wanted a bomber version instead. So basically, it was too little, too late. During the war, German scientists developed new top-secret weapons. These were missiles and rockets that did not need pilots. Hitler believed they would win the war. They were devastating, but they did not have the effect intended. They were called Vergeltungswaffen, or vengeance weapons. The first was the V-1. It was a jet-powered flying missile, or buzz bomb. It's like a crude version of a modern cruise missile. It had a speed of 400 miles per hour, but a very short range of only 160 miles. It had no guidance system. Basically, the Germans would point it toward London and only gave it enough fuel to reach the city. And then when it ran out of fuel, it would fall to the ground, and since it was full of explosives, it would cause a lot of devastation. It had an engine that sounded like a motorcycle. The people of London used to hear it going across the city, and when the engine cut out, they then would realize that the bomb was coming to the ground, and then hear the explosion. In June of 1944, the first was fired against London. Londoners thought after the Blitz there'd be no more bombings. But these were terrifying to the civilians. Over 2,540 were fired against London, killing 22,900 civilians. They were cheap to build and were devastating against the Allies. Here's a picture of one I took in a museum in Munich. The second was the V-2. This was a ballistic missile. In September of 1944, the first V-2 was fired against London. There were no warnings because the rocket travels at the speed of sound. They weren't very accurate, so they couldn't hit particular targets within London itself. The scary thing was, since they couldn't be heard, the people in London would just see an explosion that would destroy buildings and kill so many people, and they had no idea where it came from. Over 3,000 were fired at London and the Belgian city of Antwerp, killing over 7,200 civilians. They weren't very economical, though. They were very costly to build, at $3.7 million each, and they also used a lot of fuel that could have been used for their planes. Now, by 1945, Luftwaffe losses were very high, and they had lost many experienced pilots. Allied losses were soon replaced, but Luftwaffe losses in aircraft and pilots were irreplaceable. The Luftwaffe were no longer able to defend the skies over Germany as the Allied armies closed in on Berlin from the east and the west. Now, January 2nd, the British and American bombers hit Nuremberg. This was the home of the Nazi Party. We had all those huge rallies. In 1 hour, 90% of the old city was destroyed and 1,800 civilians were killed. More air raids in February caused the deaths of close to 6,000. Here we see a picture of the Old Stadt. This is the old part of the city along the Pegnitz River. In the background on the right, you see that's the church. We saw this in the Triumph of the Will movie, the church that Hitler was standing in front of when the Nazis were parading through Munich. Now we're going to talk about a very controversial issue, the bombing of Dresden. Dresden was an old historical city, as you can see here from the pictures, back to the Baroque age. The cathedral there on the right. In February of 1945, the British and Americans decide to bomb the city of Dresden, and it was very controversial since the city was of no military significance and had no defenses. And it was full of civilian refugees who were trying to escape the Soviets who were pushing in from the east. In a 2-day period, the Allies heavily bombed the city. 1,200 US and British bombers targeted Dresden in 2 days of bombing and dropped over 3,900 tons of explosives. It created a firestorm that killed around 25,000 civilians, and 90% of the city center was destroyed. Here we see American B-17 bombers dropping their bombs over Dresden and the devastation those bombs caused. 90% of the city was destroyed. This is a pile of bodies that were killed during the air raid. They're piling them up to burn them in a large funeral pyre since there was no way to identify them and they had to dispose of the bodies as quickly as possible. This is an exceptionally disturbing photograph. It shows many people that went into air raid shelters. This shows a mother with her baby in a baby carriage. The flash fires caused by the firestorm swept even into the bomb shelters and just killed everyone within a split second. This was a picture taken from the City Hall. It's been used a lot of photographs of the Dresden bombing. The statue on the right, it's like it's looking down saying, "Why was this done?" This is the Dresden Frauenkirche, in English, Church of Our Lady. It was built in the 1700s in Dresden. There were many who thought Dresden was a war crime. After the war, it would take years to rebuild Dresden. In the war, the Allies dropped 1,600,000 tons of bombs on Germany. Now, the people killed by Allied bombings in Germany have been estimated at around 635,000. And roughly 7.5 million German civilians became homeless. Now, on the Allied side, over 160,000 Allied airmen and 33,700 planes were lost. Now, the air war over Germany, without a doubt, was devastating. 1. Many German cities were destroyed and thousands of civilians were killed. 2. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was destroyed, hurting Germany's ability to defend itself. And 3. Germany's war industry was destroyed, limiting their ability to produce weapons. It didn't end the war, but the air war over Germany certainly shortened it. Now, this concludes our section on the air war over Germany. I hope you enjoyed it and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.